Hello, I am Alberto Villarreal, Managing Director of Nepanoa Transformation Advisory. We help international companies implement change in their US and Latin America operations. Today, I'm joined by Stephen Marks, Managing Director of Emmersion, an investment management firm focused on Latin America. Stephen, how are you today?
Doing well, Alberto. How are you?
It's a pleasure to speak to someone. I've been catching up just with my friends, on Zoom, FaceTime, Hangouts, and seeing that everybody's healthy, and speaking face to face, it's always good.
It always is, absolutely.
How are you doing in Medellin? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's if there's any place to be stuck, it's Medellin. Every day is beautiful, 75 degrees, weather is great. But I would say that it's really interesting to see that the way that the Colombians have responded to this crisis, in that they took very strong measures early on, federally, to shut down the country, and it's working. They're starting already to flatten the curve, which is very promising, and that's something that was really encouraging to see the country take these strong measures.
That's fantastic, and I hope that other countries, would have followed the Colombian way of taking care of the situation and really taking measures earlier than later. Stephen, you and I have spoken, over the past few weeks about the future, about the post-COVID-19 world. And as you know, Nepanoa, we just released a paper with our perspective of how that looks like when we think about business management, we think about people, we think about technology. We really believe that going back to what we think it's normal, it's really not going to be like that. There will really be a new normal. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, specifically around the business activity in Latin America. I want to touch on M&A. I want to touch on different trends that you see happening down there, specifically for manufacturing industry, BPOs, right? But first, what's your perspective of how the region, and when I mention Latin America, we're talking all the way from Mexico to Brazil, how the region was doing prior to COVID-19?
Well, it's an interesting question, because that is the perspective that you must take in analyzing future opportunities, is what has happened in the recent past. And really over the past 3 to 4 years, you've seen a very slow, gradual approach to some type of new economic stability in the region. And it's taken a long time to get to this place. There was between the global commodities prices bottoming out 3 to 4 years ago, oil and the up and down nature over the past few years, a lot of these economies, the export economies in Latin America, have taken a hit. Now, when you look at some of the countries that have started to emerge out of this over the course of the past 18 months, Brazil has seen tremendous change recently. Very optimistic about that market. Colombia as well. Panama is doing very well. Peru grew at 4% last year. I think it's in a regionalized block of Latin America, where there's different personalities, different economic styles. You've seen a gradual change towards, as I said before, or some type of facility. It also has a long way to go.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. I mean, Colombia also grew at 3% last year, if I recall correctly, right?
Yes, 3.4, if I believe, yeah.
And what do you think was driving that growth, specifically in Colombia and Peru? What specific industries do you think were driving that growth, or what investments?
Well, I think if you look at the export space, it's been very interesting to track those sectors in those countries in particular. You've started to see not only raw materials going into places like China, the US, Europe, but also, for example, in Peru, a really strong agricultural economy that has been able to take advantage of this global supply chain that's been created into various parts of the world. Colombia, very similar. Now, the industry of these countries is what has been driving this economic growth. There has been an increase also into foreign direct investment the past few years in those economies. And I think that those factors combined have led to some type of stability pre-crisis.
Well, good. I mean, it's important that we talk about the modern history, to call it a word, the recent history, right, pre-COVID, because focused on what's going to happen post-COVID, right? We do know that businesses will take a look at their supply chain, especially after this experience, and if they are fully vested in a specific region, take Asia, for example, they have now realized that the smart thing to do from every angle, from a risk angle, from a cost angle, it's to have a diversified supply chain. And I was very interested in your response right now because you mentioned, well, Alberto, we're talking about raw materials. We're also talking about manufacturing that is driving growth in Latin America. And I have a perspective, which is that companies will look into Latin America to continue diversifying their supply chain. I'm not saying that they're going to leave Asia completely, but they will look into Latin America as well to be able to bring different materials or different products from different countries. And I want to hear your perspective about that, Stephen.
Well, we're actually making a big bet on that.
Okay.
I think that the disruption that has happened recently was already starting to take form prior to the crisis and the virus. And that was in the cost of manufacturing and the cost of labor increasing in Asia. And you started to see a pivot towards Latin America. Now, obviously, Mexico has been a huge manufacturing hub for North American businesses because of NAFTA and now USMCA.
Correct.
But we look at the rest of the region as potentially being opportunistic for North American, European investors and companies that want to now pivot. Why is that? We actually view that a few factors into this, not only trying to mitigate some risk, we believe that there could be a push towards Latin America based on looking at the insurers, looking at the financiers, looking at the investors who may dictate that a company has to have some piece of their portfolio, some type of exposure into Latin America. And I don't think that you're going to see a miracle. I really don't. We've been modeling this out, but the estimates we're coming up with is somewhere between 30 to 35 billion in production could leave China. And where is it going to go? Our belief is that it is going to go into Latin America.
Well, you are vested in that interest. I am as well, right? With with what we do
right,
for Latin America to actually continue to grow. And there's an important piece that I don't want us to forget mentioning. That's the people. I mean, the talent that we have in Latin America really allows us to go into different industries, right? So we touched on manufacturing, but also from a services perspective, Stephen. I mean, we do have in Latin America very capable people that speak the language very well. And when people think about outsourcing services into another country, Latin America brings very, very specific advantages over other regions, specifically for our side of the world, right? You have time zone, you have language, you have culture. And I believe that the quality that we provide, it's second to none.
Yep. I would agree with that point. And if you look at the data supports that. Contact centers, for example, in countries like the Andean region of South America, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica as well in Central America,
Correct.
You've seen an increase in the export of contact centers between 20 to 60% over the past few years. Yeah. Now, observationally, we've seen multinationals, we've seen investors that have come to destinations like Colombia, like Peru. Why is that? There's a number of factors that go into it, and you touched on some of it, the culture, but also look at the fact that a lot of the multinationals in let's say United States, Canada, they're also now supporting bilingual operations.
Correct.
That is a tremendous asset to have a contact center in a place like Latin America that could support that population. Also, cost of labor is now competitive to Southeast Asia, India, China. So we view that sector, the BPO sector, as being a very high growth possibility. And we think that with this current economic crisis, that there's going to be even a larger pivot towards Latin America.
You're right, Stephen. You're right. I mean, when I look at BPO, or when people think about BPO, they immediately go into finance process, or they immediately go into IT services, right? Or customer service. But nowadays, BPO has modernized. I mean, now we're talking about design. We're talking about marketing. We're talking about very specialized services that can also be provided from a business process outsourcer, right?
Yes.
So, and those are the types of services that I think we're going to see, not a boom, but really, growth in Latin America.
I completely agree with that. And once again, the data and the observational data as well supports that. You've seen companies, for example, here in Colombia, actually one here in Medellin, that is doing outsourcing of marketing, outsourcing of advertising. We've seen exits. We've seen private equity investors in the United States that have acquired these types of processing businesses. So there's this tremendous opportunity, and the timing is once again, it's perfect. It's very well aligned.
Great.
A lot of the industry professionals that we speak to, you're starting to see now, obviously, and it's tragic, but you're starting to see unemployment in the United States. You're starting to see the canceling of contract and contract labor. But typically what happens then is that the outsourcing then starts to increase. And one of those industries that once again, Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica and even Brazil is very well positioned for is going to be BPO. Absolutely.
I completely agree with that. You touched on something very important, Stephen. You talked about exits. We've been seeing exits. Tell me about the M&A activity that you see down there. I agree with you. The timing is special for changes, for transformations, for every company. Organizations are malleable right now. It's a time to invest. It's a time to actually change the way that you operate and take advantage of these opportunities. So when we think about the M&A activity in Latin America, what are you seeing down there?
Well, M&A for years, or traditionally, has been dominated in Latin America by the oil and gas industry. You also see a lot of activity, obviously, in mining as well. But there has been a fundamental shift over the past few years, and the groups that have actually been the investment category that has been ahead of this has actually been venture capital. If you look at venture capital growth, that has increased from 500 million to 1.9 billion in just a few years. It's been a tremendous boom for the ecosystem in Latin America. Now, one of the if you look at private equity, the smart private equity investors have just now started to figure this out. And there's been a push towards private equity investment in Latin America, but there's still I would say a fundamental misunderstanding of the Latin American market that you see with traditional middle market investors in the United States. They're still apprehensive for making investments into the region. Why is that? Because they don't have anybody on the ground. They don't have anybody that they can work with, somebody like you, somebody like me who understands what's happening. And so that lack of understanding has I guess, they haven't been looking at the opportunities that they should look at. But one thing that we do know is that valuations in the United States have only sharply risen over the past 5 years. And that's key. 20 to 25 companies, firms, private equity firms battling for the same deal. In Latin America, there might be 2. So it's a huge difference in terms of normalized valuations, which Latin America has another benefit for as well.
Stephen, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I don't want to take a lot of your time. So any closing remarks or anything else that we should talk about?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head in that there's going to be a fundamental shift into Latin America for manufacturing, for BPO, but also other industry sectors are going to benefit as well. We've seen the healthcare industry, privatized healthcare industry, real estate. We've seen tremendous opportunities in those sectors as well. And I'm going to go back to the point that I just made. I think the way that you can, an investor or a company can enter the region is by working with somebody who knows what they're doing and talk to the right people. And now is a good time to be having those conversations, gather some insight, learn from the professionals, somebody like you, somebody like me, and our respective networks, and then go from there and make a concrete decision. Correct.
I completely agree with that. It's get aligned with a partner that can accompany you in Latin America. That's what it is. Stephen, thank you very much for your time. Please stay safe And I hope to see you back in the U.S. soon.
Absolutely. You too, Alberto. Thank you for inviting me, and best of luck to you and your family. Take care.
Take care, buddy. Bye-bye.